All right. Who is familiar with the Abbott and Costello routine, Who's on First? Has everyone heard that? Yeah, it's probably one of the most famous comedy routines of all time. I heard as I was looking up some of the details that it actually, they are the only non-baseball people inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and it plays on a continuous loop there. So, it's, yeah, you imagine being the person who has to hear that over and over. And the whole thing, there's different variations to this setup, but Costello, the shorter, rounder of the two, is talking to Abbott and asking him about this baseball team. He wants to know the names of the players, and Abbott knows the names, and he introduces it with the fact that, that players are using nicknames nowadays, and so he starts and tells him who's on first, and of course that leads to all the confusion. Well, do you happen? I thought about even showing it. Thought about doing things. Here's what I decided: little quiz. Do you remember the names of the people on the bases? Who's on first? What's on second? I don't know's on third. So those are the three big ones. In left field is why, and of course that's up. You know why? I just want to know. Center field is because, and there's no right fielder ever mentioned in any of the routines. Now, it said there's some board game that came up with the right fielder and gave him the name Nobody. So, but in none of the routines, it's never there. The pitcher, tomorrow. Of course, same thing. Who's the pitcher? Well, tomorrow. And catcher is today. And then it ends, Abbott says something, and Costello says, I don't give a darn. And Abbott says, he's our shortstop. And if you've ever seen that, again, it's been voted like the best comedy routine of all time because there's, a great deal of comedy with them not being able to communicate with each other. But if you've ever been in that situation, it's not always as funny, is it? Have you ever been in a situation where you're trying to get something across to someone and they're just not getting it at all? Or maybe they're trying to get it across to you and you're frustrated. Yeah, usually it's not funny. Well, we've been seeing it in Matthew a lot. I mean, you could almost call it one of the overall themes of Matthew. And Jesus is the one that you have to wonder, it's like, oh, did you get frustrated, Jesus? He's telling these people, including his inner group of disciples, he's telling them about the kingdom. He's telling them about his messiahship, and they're not getting it. He's just started to tell him, we saw, starting in chapter 16, he's telling him, I came to die. And, at first they argue with him, then they're sad. It says, I came to die and not set up this physical kingdom. And they just keep asking, yeah, but how about that physical kingdom? He tells them the greatest in the kingdom, to be the greatest, even to enter, you have to have the humility of a child. And right after that, yeah, but can we have the two seats right next to you? And you look at that like, boy, you aren't getting it. And then last week we started Matthew 21, the last week of Jesus' life. He enters on Palm Sunday. And you remember, if you look at it from the outside, everything looks great. Here's this crowd of people welcoming Jesus. They're waving the palm branches, throwing down their cloaks. They're shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. They're welcoming the Messiah into Jerusalem. And everything looks great until you realize they don't get it. When you dig underneath those things, you see everything that they did, the branches, the Hosanna, all that. There were ways to welcome a conquering king. And so they're thinking one thing, and Jesus is thinking the exact total opposite. He knows I'm riding into Jerusalem to die. And then he goes to the temple. And you see this same idea of not getting it. Here he finds all these people and they're selling things. They're exchanging money, selling animals. And he calls it a den of robbers. And really it seems that the meaning of that has more the idea of a nationalistic stronghold. You Jews, you think just because you have the temple, that's enough. They had the same idea and attitude toward the law. We have the law. That's what's important. We're Jews. That's what's important. You remember, clear in the beginning, John the Baptist said to the Jewish leaders, if God wants, he can raise up sons of Abraham from these stones. That was just so radically different than what they thought. No, we're special just because we are Jews. Jesus says, no, in the temple area, it says this place that you've made a nationalistic stronghold is supposed to be a house of prayer. And that gives the indication of this contrast of the two different viewpoints. The Jews, again, from the disciples, the people, the leaders, certainly, they were focused on the physical. a physical Messiah, a physical kingdom, physical actions in the temple instead of prayer. They're focused on the physical. Jesus comes to focus on the spiritual. That's the kind of Messiah he is. That's the kind of kingdom he's coming to set up. That's where his focus is. And as we said last week, corresponding to physical and spiritual, when we're focused on the physical, we're really focused on me. I'm focused on me, even if I'm doing things for God. I may be doing things like the Jews were doing all kinds of godly things, praying and reading and worshiping, all that, but they were really focused on themselves. They weren't focused on God. It's only when we focus on the spiritual that we're focused on God, and I suppose you could say it's sort of cyclical. It's only when we're focused on God that we're truly focused on the spiritual. If we're focused on me, I'm going to be looking at everything through those physical eyes there. Well, that's what we've been seeing, and we have to realize that this subject here, that's really the heart of Matthew, it's the heart of the Christian life. And so I need to ask myself, am I getting it? I just think of those crowds. It just struck me. Again, they're waving, they're shouting, and it looks like, wow, everything that we're in this, Jewish life for, it's happening. And they were totally missing it. And I thought about, what about us as Christians? We show up here, we do these things like, God, I want you in my life. And could I be totally missing it? We asked the question last week, how do I know whose expectations I'm living by? And I didn't say whose expectations, because that would make it sound like, well, you can answer the question, whose is it, yours or God's? I asked, how do I know? Because they thought they were living by God's expectations. They thought they were focused on the same thing he was, but you look at it and you realize they're not. What about me? Am I living by God's expectations or mine? Am I focused on the spiritual or the physical? So we talked about expectations or focus. We said that you could call it God's plan versus our plan. And today we're going to look at another word that's sort of a synonym, God's purpose. Why did he do what he did? Why did he create? Why did he call Israel? Why did he create the church? What is his purpose? And our guiding statement today is there's no excuse for missing God's purpose. We're going to see through a couple parables, there really is no excuse. People did it, but it shouldn't happen. And they did it then, and we see all throughout the Bible, the things that they do, we may at first look at that and say, how in the world could you? But when we're open and honest, we realize, man, I can do the same thing. And so this is what we're looking at today. There's no excuse for missing God's purpose. Let's start in verse 33 of Matthew 21. Jesus says, listen to another parable. You remember we ended last week with Jesus told a parable about two sons, and the father said to the first, he said, go out into the kingdom, or go out into the field and work. And the son said, no, I won't, but then he did. He said to the second one, go out in the field and work. He said, yes, I will, but he didn't. And the point there is, what we're talking about in this whole section, it's what you really, what characterizes you that matters, not just what you say on the outside. So Jesus says, listen to another one. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. So he put in a lot of effort. He invested a lot into this vineyard. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. They would keep a share of the fruit themselves, and that's what they would sell and live off of. But a portion of it, as to the landowner, it would go to him. He was entitled to it. But verse 35, the tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw his son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. And we don't know if they thought maybe the father had died and the son was coming to claim it, and they thought, we get rid of him, it'll be ours. So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Then Jesus asked this question of the crowd there, including the Jewish leaders. He says, therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? And notice that there's no question, there's no debate. They know exactly what is just and fair. They say in verse 41, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end. And he will rent the vineyard to other tenants who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, and there he is again to these guys who read the scriptures all day, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Now, initially that verse was focused on Israel. God has selected Israel out of all the nations. They are the chief stone, and the other nations would look at them and say, why Israel? But God did that. Well, Jesus is now applying it to himself, and we'll see this later on in the New Testament. It gets applied to Jesus. He says, therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you to the Jewish leaders, to national Israel, and given to a people who will produce its fruit. Now, it doesn't mean just Gentiles. It means anyone who will produce the fruit of God. Anyone who falls on this stone, going back to Jesus, will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. So, in the Borg, resistance is futile. Then, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. So you look at this here, and of course the landowner is God. The tenants are the nation of Israel. And God, throughout his interaction with Israel, throughout his relationship with them, the servants that were sent there, the prophets. And Israel, you read through the Old Testament, and many times the prophets were rejected to the point of being beaten and killed. And now it culminates in the Son, who is Jesus, being sent. And what are the tenants going to do? What is Israel going to do? And on the national level, Israel did the same thing. They killed Jesus. We know what's coming. Well, again, the point today is there's no excuse for missing God's purpose. This parable tells us the responsibility that God's people have is clear. There was no debate. As you look at this, it wasn't like the people said, well, those tenants, well, maybe they didn't have to pay. No, it was absolutely clear in that parable what their responsibility was. Well, the same thing. Israel's responsibility, being called by God, was crystal clear. They knew what they should do. God's people, it's not a surprise. It's not something that we're unaware. The responsibility is clear. Well, then Jesus shows the other side of it with a second parable. It says he spoke to them again in parables, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Now, how it would work in those days is anyone that was having a wedding banquet, and remember, when there was a wedding, it wasn't a one-day affair. It was multi-days, and really, the more money you had, probably the longer it was. And what they would do is they would tell the people invited far in advance, several months in advance, to let them know it's coming, it's going to happen. But they weren't as down to the detail often as we were, so they couldn't tell them a date. This is coming down the road. You're invited. And then when it was just about to happen, that's when they would send out the second invitation. Well, that's what he's talking about here. The people knew they'd been invited, months ago. Now the king's servants are saying the time is right now. And it says they refused to come. Well, the king already shows his patience then. Verse 4, his initial response, he sent some more servants. He said, tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. Now, you might think that's a little out of proportion, don't you think? A little overblown. But that's the point of a parable. He's making this, and it certainly fits what happened in reality with Israel. Well, verse 7, the king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. Now you look at this, and again, it's Israel. It's talking about God through a banquet, and Israel was the ones who were initially invited to that. But we see what happened. Again, throughout their history, they didn't come to the banquet. And definitely at the culmination of it with Jesus there, they refused to come. And so it says that then the king says, all right, now I'm going to open up the invitations to everybody. And it says the bad as well as the good. And that's the point. It's now no longer just one select nation. It's everyone, wherever you were, is invited. Everyone's invited to come. Well, again, the point that we're looking at, there's no excuse for missing God's purpose. First parable said the responsibility is clear. This parable shows us the opportunity is clear. Think of what this was. Think of what a blessing this would be. This was a king's wedding feast. Back then, some of us, we go out on a Friday night or a Saturday night or midweek, you want to beat the crowds. We've got things we do. There's special parties, there's events. They didn't have stuff like that. Wedding feasts, they were the big party. And if you were invited to a king's wedding feast, just imagine what that would be like. Even today, did anyone watch the royal wedding years ago and the one before that? Lisa loves the royal weddings. They're like a wedding times 50. Well, this would be the same thing. This king's wedding, any wedding would be great. A king's wedding. Just try to get in your mind what a blessing this would be, what an honor. This would be a lifetime event they were invited to. This was a blessing for them. And then look what it says. They refused to come. And why? Well, one went to his field and one went to his business. Jesus is making this point. He's like, any excuse you make is foolish. I mean, maybe, I'm dying, or I did this, my son, I need to. No, I just went off to my field, went off to my business, instead of going to a wedding feast for a king. It's making the point. We need to see that's just absolutely ridiculous. The two don't even compare. This was such an opportunity, such a blessing, and they rejected it. There's just no excuse for that. And it goes on to say, it brings back in the responsibility side. Look what it says in verse 11. And this might be sort of the wait a minute element, like, okay, we're going along at this wedding, and what comes up now? Verse 11, but when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked him, how did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend? The man was speechless. Then the king told his attendants, tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Like, wow, weren't expecting that at the wedding, were you? You imagine being at a wedding and comes in some guy thrown out, not just, asked to leave, thrown out. And, that's the language that's used of hell, as Jesus makes this point. Well, it's showing us, again, that there is a responsibility. And I remember hearing, and now it's sort of been rejected, that the background of this, the cultural background, is when a king had a wedding, he would supply the wedding clothes, and so this person had no excuse. And they're starting to realize now, and it doesn't seem like there's any historical basis for that. But the same point is true, though. He should have at least worn some nicer clothes, not his work clothes. And one thing that parable definitely makes clear: the man is speechless. He doesn't say, oh, but I didn't have time. Oh, but these are my only clothes. He has no excuse. He realizes what he did was without excuse. There is a responsibility that we have here. But the responsibility, and here's what we're going to talk about more in a minute, it's not to any certain level of something. It's a basic foundational commitment. Now, I thought it was interesting what Jesus said, or, in the parable, the king said to his servants, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited at first did not deserve to come. Well, why didn't they deserve to come? Because they didn't come. He invited them. They must have deserved to come at first. He sent out the invitation. It's just the fact they rejected it. It's not that he looked at them later and said, oh, you're not good enough. They just didn't make that commitment to even show up. And the same thing with this wedding guest. The king didn't come in and say, look, those clothes, good try, but not good enough. No, he says, you didn't even try. You didn't even make a commitment to wear the proper clothes. And that's why the person's speechless. He doesn't say, oh, well, okay, I'll do a little better at this. I tried. No. It's this idea we have a responsibility, and that's what that last verse means. For many are invited, but few are chosen. The gospel is to be preached to everyone. But the ones who are chosen, and if this was the only verse we have, you could think God chooses and we have no say in the matter, but other verses make it clear. It's who are the ones chosen by God, the ones that will be in heaven for eternity? Well, it's the ones who make the commitment. Again, in this parable, everyone was invited, but he looked at someone who didn't even make a commitment, who didn't respond to the invitation with just a basic commitment. So once again, today, these two parables, they show us there's no excuse for missing God's purpose. And I want to look at that from a couple angles. First of all, what God expects and offers his followers should be totally clear. What God expects of his followers and what God offers to his followers should be totally clear. And we're focusing today on followers. Really, you could make the same application in a lot of ways for unbelievers, but this is about the followers. It's about Israel, and it's about then going to the church. What God expects should be totally clear. What God offers should be totally clear. And they correspond to the parables. Expects, well, that's the responsibility we saw in that first parable. Israel had a responsibility. It was known from the time God called Abram, and we've been seeing this as we go through Genesis, from the time God called him, he had a responsibility to obey God, to follow him, to make a commitment to God. And the nation did as well. God made that clear. You remember when they came out of Egypt and Moses and the people? And they had the blessing and curse ceremony on the two mountains. And God says, if you are obedient to me, if you remain committed to me, I will bless you. If you don't, there will be curses. There was a responsibility that was totally clear to them. And it's clear for us too, because when Israel rejects it, when those first tenants, they kill the son, what did he say? I'm going to give the field to other tenants. But he specifically says, this king will do it, who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. There's a responsibility that we have to serve God. There's a responsibility that we have to live for him. What God expects is clear, and what God offers is clear. Again, there was no better illustration in Jesus' day than a king's wedding feast. You couldn't think of a better party. I mean, we could sit here, and I don't know what your ideal thing would be. Luxury box tickets to the Super Bowl, or whatever. I'm sorry, women, I can't think of anything that might correspond to, I don't know, a cruise, to wherever. Yeah, whatever you can think of. This was the top of the list, an invitation to a king's wedding feast. This was the ultimate opportunity, the ultimate blessing. The original invitations, again, they went out to the nation of Israel. What a privilege they had to be God's chosen people. Out of everyone, God called Abraham. He created a nation. They had a special place with God. But they rejected that. On the national level, they rejected that. And so God then said, I'll invite everyone, and that includes us. And so now we have this opportunity. We have this opportunity. The Bible talks about, we have the chance of an abundant life. We have the chance of peace. We have the chance of joy. Everything that Jesus offers, it's now offered to us. But we still have a responsibility. That second parable talks about the wedding guest. And it's combating the idea that Israel had that we deserve what God has for us just because. We're Jews, so we deserve the blessings. We have the law, so we deserve the blessings. We have the temple, so we deserve. They were entitled. Sometimes I think as Christians, God, I've done this, so I deserve. I've done this good thing. I've done that good. I showed up at church. I prayed. I did this nice. I'm entitled. And God says, no. No, those things aren't there. There's a responsibility that comes even in the midst of the opportunity. And the thing we need to realize, and I said it once, but I want to say it again, the responsibility is our basic foundational commitment. Here's probably the biggest lesson from today, is the responsibility. It's not to a certain level of good works. It's not specific good works. The focus here is on this basic level of commitment. Again, the issue with the tenants and the wedding guests was not their level of obedience. Jesus didn't look at the tenants and say, you didn't pay me enough rent. No, there was no commitment at all. It wasn't on, you were not quite good enough. No, you absolutely rejected me. There was no commitment. The wedding guest, it wasn't like they showed up a little late, you don't get in. No, they refused to come. The man who was called out for his clothes, again, it wasn't like you didn't dress up quite well enough. No, you didn't do it at all. Do you see the difference there? Jesus is not looking and say, you're not good enough. You tried, but you fell short. No. He's saying you didn't even have that basic, foundational, fundamental commitment. And we've been seeing this all through Matthew. And we've said, even our commitment doesn't have to be perfect. God doesn't look and say, well, your commitment's not perfect enough, but it does have to be total. We can't have some area of our life that we say, God, this is off the table. This is off limits. I'm committed to you except here. Our commitment has to be total. It will never be perfect. It will grow and mature, and we won't live up to it at times, but it has to be there. It has to be total, and that's what this is all about. They had an absolute lack of commitment. And for us, sometimes, again, we miss the fact that it's the commitment where God's focusing. That's where, in Luke 9:23, the verse we talk about over and over, it's on your handout. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. That is foundational commitment. Now, there's other places in the Bible that talk about some of the specific things that should flow from that commitment, but God says to become a disciple, this is what a disciple is. It's someone who has that commitment. That's what we see in the first one. And you know what? The other thing in these parables that struck me is this commitment. It's not extra. It's not like you could separate it. Again, you look at these renters. There was no one in the audience, and there's none of us who thought, well, I wonder if these are the kind of renters who pay rent or the kind of renters who don't pay rent. Because, it's just logical to have both. No, it's not. If you're a renter, you pay rent. I wonder if these are the wedding guests that the king expected to attend, or he really thought, well, they'll blow him off. Like, no. It's part of the story. If you're a tenant, you pay rent. If you're a guest and said you would come, you show up. It's not extra. Well, the same thing with commitment. Again, if we believe that there's a God who created the universe and that he sustains and keeps the universe running, and he sent his son to redeem us, commitment is then not optional. You don't say, well, gee, I wonder if I should be committed to him in this relationship or not. I'm going to opt for the non-committed relationship. No, it's not an option. It is just integral. It's inherent in the relationship. It was with Israel, it is with us today. It's the implication of being called by God, the Creator, the Sustainer, and the Redeemer. So, again, the first key idea is this: what God expects and offers his followers should be totally clear. But it's not. The second idea, yet God's followers still miss his purpose for them, don't they? And don't we? And you could even go so far as to say God's followers sometimes reject his purpose for them. Now, remember, this passage that we're talking about, it started in the beginning of chapter 21 with the crowd shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, and they were missing his purpose. But now we're focused on these Jewish leaders, and they're out and out rejecting it. But we've been seeing in Matthew, and we said it last week, missing often leads to rejecting. These same people on Sunday who were shouting Hosanna, they're going to be some of the ones in the crowd on Friday shouting Crucify. These same leaders who were trying to kill Jesus now, they were the ones who were just missing it when he was a baby and the Magi came into town. And they just were missing things. Now they've absolutely rejected Jesus. Missing often leads to rejecting. And so you see what happens here. They miss it. That Jesus gives them the parable of the talents. And it says, verse 45, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. There was no question. There was no, well, maybe. There was no debate. Well, Jesus, let us give our side of the story. They knew what Israel had done in the past. They knew it was wrong, and they knew what they were doing. There is no excuse. And so did they turn around and say, you're right, Jesus, we're sorry? No, verse 46, they looked for a way to arrest him. They were going to arrest him, and we've seen earlier, they want to kill him. The only thing that kept them from doing that, it wasn't some conviction in their heart. They were afraid of the crowd because the people held he was a prophet. If they could have got it done right then, they would have arrested him, put him on trial, and killed him. They still missed it. The purpose is clear. We just saw that, but they miss it. The parable of the wedding. Jesus tells that one. What a special opportunity the nation of Israel has had, but they've blown it. And the leaders, what happens then? Well, I didn't read verse 15, but you look down there. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They hear it. It's clear. And what's their response? Let's get rid of him. Let's bring on the very punishment he's talking about, the rejection of God on our nation. Let's don't repent and stop it. Let's rush head forward and bring it on. And I look at that and I ask the question, how could that happen? And I think this is the root problem today. Then we look at these stories and passages in the Bible, and often there's a root problem. And I sort of compare it, it'd be like if you were trying to do a math sheet, and for some reason you thought 2 + 2 was 5. You knew how to do, subtraction and addition, but you had that root problem. Well, every time that came up in that math worksheet, even though you know the rest of it, that's going to mess you up, isn't it? Well, a lot of times there's a root problem, and we get the first thing, but there's something underneath that's keeping us from, we're filtering it through the wrong filter. And the root problem today is, it goes back to what we've been talking about. I think it's some confusion over actions versus commitment. I think it comes down to confusion on the part of God's people, Israel and us, between our actions, godly actions, and our commitment to God. And I say this because, again, I see it here, but we also saw it, and it was great to see how things come together in the Bible study the past few weeks in going through Genesis. We've seen the same thing. You know, we talked about Abram. Here's this person called by God, the special, of all the people, he's the one who's going to be the father of the chosen nation. And we've looked at some of his choices, you remember? He goes to Egypt when he's not supposed to. He has a son with Hagar when he shouldn't. He lies about his wife twice, and we look and say, really, God? And we wonder, why didn't you get rid of this guy? And from what we can tell, it's because even though he did some things that weren't good, that weren't right, he still had a commitment to God. He still had that foundational commitment. We saw it last week a little bit in the Bible study, Esau and Jacob. You look at those two. Why is it Jacob gets the inheritance? Why is it he's the one? Well, it seems like he had a commitment to God and what that was, and Esau didn't. And then the one example that got brought up, Angelica brought it up, and it was just, clearly eye-opening. You look at Saul and David. Israel says, we want a king. And the first choice for king is Saul. And God says to him, I will make your descendants. You will be the kings over Israel. But it was conditional, and Saul, he blew it. But you remember what he did? There was two things that Saul did that got him kicked out as king and kept him, he lived as king, but it didn't pass on to his son. The first one was there was a time where there's about to be a battle, and the prophet and priest Samuel said to him, don't sacrifice to God, animals to God, until I get there. Now, that would be something they would do before going into battle. It was important to the people, important to the army. Well, Samuel's running late for whatever reason. Got kept up on priestly business, and he's running late, and Saul decides to sacrifice himself. Samuel says, you shouldn't have done that. And then there's another time where God has said through his servant Samuel to Saul, he says, all right, this battle here, I'm going to give you the victory, but you are to put to death all the animals, not to take plunder for yourself, and all the army that you're facing. That was, for this particular battle, that was God's instruction. And Saul didn't do it. Samuel shows up this time, and he says, what is this I hear? What the bleating of sheep in my ears? That they're all supposed to be dead. And so Saul gets cut off. His line does not inherit the kingdom. And it goes to David. Well, stop and think for a second. What do we know about David? You got the whole Goliath thing, and that's pretty cool. But David had a couple big issues in his life, didn't he? You remember David committed adultery. And he covered it up by committing murder. And I think if you were to ask anyone whether they'd had a Bible background or not, okay, rank these sins in order of seriousness. You got sacrificing some animals without the priest. You got not putting animals to death. You have adultery and murder. Is there anyone that is reasonably going to say, well, yeah, those animal things, that's the really bad stuff? No, if you just look at the level of the actions, David was much worse. But what the difference was is David was committed to God and Saul wasn't. It tells us in Acts 13, after removing Saul, God made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. Now, he did some things God didn't want him to do. But he says he's a man after mine own heart. What's that saying about David? David's heart was after God's heart. David was committed in his heart to God, and Saul wasn't. You remember when Saul is confronted with his sins, he makes excuses. Well, you didn't show up. The people were leaving. Well, this I'm doing it for God. But when David's confronted with his sin, look what it says in Psalm 51. He says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. He admits he sinned. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. All against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. I think this is the key. I think the key here is you look at Israel, and Israel did all kinds of godly things. Again, Jesus is talking to the leaders. They spent their days, day in, day out, reading the Bible, praying, worshiping, sacrificing. They did all the godly things. But their focus really wasn't on God. It was on them. It wasn't on the spiritual. It was on the physical. And so they confused that with being committed to God. If you were to ask them, are you right with God? Well, yes, because we do all these things. But they weren't committed to God. And again, the Saul and David example to me illustrates it. It matters what's in our heart. It's not saying that, murder and adultery weren't important, because there's consequences. Is what we've been seeing in Genesis. There are consequences to our actions, but God's focus is on our heart. Are you committed to me in your heart or not? You say you know these things in your mind, that's great, but is your heart committed? The actions will follow from that. Not always consistently, but they will. Well, for us, I think it's the same potential problem. I think we can easily get caught up on, God, I do all these Christian things, but are we committed to Him? In fact, I even thought about it, and we've talked a lot about the fact that, and it's one reason I try to use the word whenever I can, we're disciples, not just Christians. Because a lot of people have this idea that a Christian, well, that's a person who's, believes in God, he's been forgiven, he's going to heaven. A disciple, oh, that's like graduate level stuff. That's like the next, I don't know if I signed up for that one. And even the names, what's a Christian? What do you think of when you think of a Christian? Well, they do certain things. They read the Bible, they pray, they believe, they do, or they don't do. We know Christians, they don't do this and this and this. That's a Christian. What's a disciple? Oh, wow, that's someone that's really serious. That's someone who's committed. And even the names have sort of come to mean that. Christians do certain things or don't. Disciples, that's serious commitment. And we've separated them, and really we put our focus on the actions, on the things we do or don't do. Now, again, don't get me wrong, commitment. And when I talk about commitment, we've been saying commitment's really the idea of faith. Again, it's one thing to believe there's a God, that Jesus was a son and died for sins. It's another to have faith, to commit to that, to rest my weight upon it. I love the Indiana Jones in that third movie. He comes to believe there's a bridge in front of him he can't see, but it's not faith until he steps out there. Well, same thing. We say we believe, that's great, but are we committed? We're resting our weight on it. That's faith. Commitment, faith, will lead to actions. That's what James said, the verse we're probably familiar with. Faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Faith will lead to actions. Matter of fact, if it doesn't, you don't really have faith. But the key point is they're not the same. Faith, commitment, is not the same as the actions. And I think the confusion there is what messes up a lot of people. I think it messed up the leaders in Jesus' day. I think it messes a lot of us up. We look and say, God, I'm doing all of these things. I must be committed. Like, what a perfect example in these Jewish leaders. They were doing more things than all of us in this room put together. More godly things. They weren't committed to God at all. We need to look at our commitment, and that, I believe, is the key to overcoming. We need to realize if we have the wrong focus, if I've gotten caught up in the things that God wants me to do, and that's blocked the question of whether I'm committed to God or not. And really it comes down to, the classic, again, as we look at these, I always like to put them in columns, physical and spiritual, and focus on me and focus on God. Well, you could also put the physical focus on me, that's legalism. Legalism is focused on actions. How good do you do? What have you done? What haven't you done? What should you do? It's all about actions, where grace is focused on faith. It says in Ephesians, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. Through that commitment, not just believing the right things, but committing to it in your heart. And again, a commitment that's never going to be perfect, but is total, is complete. You haven't said there's off-limits areas to you, God. No, I'm committed. Yes or no? The answer is yes. Am I perfect? Not at all. Would I get into heaven? Would I be right with God based on my level of good works, of my actions? Not at all. But my commitment's there. And that's where we need to focus. Does that make sense? I think that's how, again, I look at this passage, and it's like, how could you Jewish leaders, how could you get to this point? How could the people, how could you, and I think they look, we do all these things for God, it must be okay. We've got all this religious trappings. We've got the law, the temple. It must be good. And God's saying there's no commitment. They're showing there's no commitment. So what do I need to do? I think we need to ask a couple questions, a lot like last week. I need to ask myself a question, and I need to ask God something. First of all, ask myself, am I committed to God, or do I just do godly things? There's nothing wrong with doing godly things. God wants us to do godly things. But he wants them to come out of a heart that's truly committed. And I think it's so possible for us to do godly things and miss the fact that I'm not really committed to God. I'm doing some godly things, but it's on that physical motivation side of things. I worship God. Well, yeah, I just feel so good when I sing those songs. I come to church, it makes my week so much better. Are those things true? I hope they are, but am I doing these things for me or am I doing them for God? Because again, it's what starts off missing the point can end up rejecting the point. And maybe if not us, maybe in the next generation, they look and see something and it's not enough. And so ends up rejecting in their generation. Am I committed to God or just doing godly things? And then ask God to help me get it. That's been my prayer for a long time now. For me, for us as a church, God, help me get it. I don't want to miss out, God. It's just so clear. Again, the responsibility is clear, but also the opportunity, the blessings of what I can have in this life with you if I truly live it committed to you. I don't want to miss that. And so we get into the growth triangle. We look at the Word. What's it say there in the Bible? What's it show us when we really dig down deep? In my situations that life experiences, how have things worked? Have I noticed a difference? Okay, does it have anything to do with my level of commitment? Am I committed? And as I talk with other disciples, we need to ask each other. We need to talk about this with each other. Have we been confused in substituting our godly actions for a commitment to God? And then I always like to end with, what will it look like? When we put this into practice, what will it look like? And I wasn't very original, but I thought, it's going to look like people who are living out the responsibility that we do have. We can't deny that. If there's a God who created us, who sustains us and redeems us, I'm His. And that's really, we've said many times, that's the reason a lot of people don't want to become Christians in the first place. Sometimes I think they see it clearer than some Christians who've been there see it. Like, if I become a Christian, I've got to radically change the way I live. Sometimes I look at Christians and they're like, no, you don't. I didn't. No, we should live out that responsibility, but then we should also experience the opportunity. Again, God says, I came to give you abundant life. I came that you would have joy, that you would have peace. Not as the world gives peace when everything's going well, they've got peace. In the midst of troubles, you can have peace. You can consider it all joy when you're going through trials. That's what Jesus said. That's what we have to experience if we're committed. Well, I always say the real last thing is we start to live it out and we interact a little bit. And once again, you'll see there's nothing specific there. What comes to your mind as we talk about this? What comes to mind as we hear this? Initial thoughts, things that, this idea of the difference between commitment and actions. Did that resonate? Did that make sense?